Garrett Wells hadn't planned on moving back to his late brother's property, but when the estate was transferred to him earlier that year, it felt less like a decision and more like a reckoning he couldn't avoid. The house itself was a modest single-story structure set back from the road by a long gravel drive, flanked by brush and an uneven split-rail fence. It wasn't picturesque, not in the way people imagined countryside living with wraparound porches and fresh paint. No, this was the kind of place that had grown into the land. Weathered shingles, cracked concrete steps, rust stains on the gutters. It hadn't been cleaned out since Mark passed, and Garrett knew that if he didn't take it on, no one else would. He wasn't sentimental about it, not really, but the place had history. His brother had lived a small life here, working a job at the equipment rental yard and spending weekends tuning old tools, riding the same aging ATV around the back lot to haul brush or pick up fallen limbs. When Garrett pulled up to the property for the first time in nearly 2 decades, that same ATV sat beneath a tarp near the shed, one tire flat, the seat bleached from years of sun, but still solid, still capable. It was the first thing he touched that felt like Mark. Not the letters in the house, not the furniture or the boots by the door, just that stubborn old machine that seemed to be waiting. Garrett spent the next few evenings working on it, not because he needed it for anything urgent, but because it gave him something to do with his hands besides grief. He cleaned the carburetor, changed the oil, ordered new spark plugs and tires online, and watched instructional videos with a pad and pencil in his lap like it was a new language. It started up on the 4th attempt, coughing smoke and life into the cool dusk air, and Garrett let it idle while he stood with his arms crossed, watching it rumble like an old dog that had just remembered how to bark. The neighborhood had changed. It wasn't like it had been in the 80s when the Wells brothers would ride their bikes down the dusty road, when the houses were more spread out, and people kept to themselves. Now it was quieter in that suspicious kind of way where the lawns were too neat and you didn't see many people outside unless it was for something organized. Bin day, leaf pickup, pressure washing the siding on weekends. Garrett didn't mind solitude. In fact, he preferred it. After working with people for most of his life in technical consulting and later running his own small business, he'd grown comfortable with silence. He knew what it cost to be constantly available to others, and he had no desire to return to that version of himself. Still, even in silence, there were things that made themselves known. On his second week at the house, Garrett was rolling the ATV out into the gravel for a short drive around the perimeter. The property bordered a stretch of unused wooded land that hadn't been developed yet. Some locals called it the slope, though there wasn't much slope to it anymore. He wanted to test how the new tires held on uneven terrain. That's when she appeared. Not from a driveway or behind a fence, but from a trimmed patch of lawn that looked like it had been cut with tweezers. She wore a pale cardigan over a collared blouse and beige slacks, the kind of outfit that said she had nowhere to be but wanted to be seen as busy anyway. She moved with purpose, her posture crisp, like she'd spent decades practicing how to be taken seriously in her own living room. "Excuse me," she called out, her tone both alert and accusing. Garrett stopped the ATV, turned down the throttle, and waited. He didn't dismount or wave. She didn't introduce herself. "You can't ride that here," she said, crossing her arms. "This isn't that kind of area." Garrett blinked at her, adjusted the brim of his hat, and asked, "Is that so?" She took a step forward, careful not to touch the gravel. "It's loud, it kicks up dirt, and you're not allowed to operate non-licensed motorized vehicles on shared land. That thing shouldn't be on the road or on the trail behind the houses. It's not safe." Garrett, still calm, leaned forward on the handlebars slightly. "This is private property," he said, "and this machine is registered and insured. I'm not taking it onto the street, just around the edge of my own lot." She didn't back off. "That trail's been used by others. I walk my dog there. Other people walk there too. You can't just assume you're the only one." "I'm not assuming anything," Garrett replied. "I know where my property lines are. I'm not trying to cause trouble." That was when she smiled. Not a warm smile, not even a forced one, but a controlled expression that told him she wasn't interested in discussion. "That thing is a hazard," she said. "If it's left out, someone could get hurt. If it's used improperly, it could damage the trail. I'm going to report this." "To who?" he asked. Her eyes gleamed just slightly. "To the community board and the county if I have to. Don't be surprised if it's removed." Garrett didn't reply. He let the silence stretch between them, let it become uncomfortable. She hated that, he could tell. People like her operated best when they were the ones filling space. She finally turned and walked back toward her yard, her spine straight as a ruler. That night, Garrett stored the ATV inside the shed, locked the doors, and placed a chain through the axle just to be safe. He wasn't worried, not exactly, but there was something unsettling about her certainty. She wasn't blustering. She believed she had authority, and more importantly, she believed in her own version of right and wrong to a degree that ignored every boundary except the ones she'd invented. Garrett had dealt with people like that before. Not in neighborhoods, but in offices, boardrooms, procurement departments. People who read one document, misunderstood it, and spent the next decade enforcing their misinterpretation like gospel. The following day, the ATV was gone. There was no note, no citation, no tire marks except the ones Garrett had made rolling it out the night before. The shed door was left open, the lock gone, the chain lying cut in the dirt like it had never mattered. Garrett stood over the spot for a long time, his mind running through possibilities like a flowchart: theft, towing, some kind of municipal overreach, but none of it made sense without notice. He walked the property lines, checked the trail, even knocked on one neighbor's door to ask if they'd seen anything. They hadn't. By afternoon, Garrett was at the local sheriff's office filing a report. The deputy on duty seemed genuinely helpful until he looked up the case file and found an administrative entry noting that a vehicle had been removed for safety concerns related to abandonment. Garrett raised an eyebrow. Removed by who? The deputy scrolled the screen. It doesn't say. Usually it'd be public works or community maintenance, but that'd show up here. Might have been a private report processed through a board. "I didn't abandon it," Garrett said. "It was locked in a shed, on my land. You know how many tools are in that shed? Nobody took those." The deputy leaned back, sympathetic but limited. "I'll make a note and flag the report. If it was towed, someone will call it in. If it was something else, well, you might need to talk to your local board." Garrett didn't argue. He took the case number and left. He didn't head home, though. Instead, he drove to the next town over, where he'd bought the GPS tracker he'd installed during repairs. The battery on those lasted months. He pulled up the web interface from his phone in the parking lot, typed in the device ID, and stared at the blinking blue dot. The ATV was still in the area. It hadn't gone to impound. It hadn't been stripped. It hadn't been stolen for resale. It was less than 4 blocks away, inside someone's backyard. And if the satellite map was correct, it was sitting squarely in the center of Karen's pristine lawn. Garrett didn't rush to confront her. That wasn't how he operated. He'd made a career by not reacting immediately, by analyzing patterns, tracking data, measuring outcomes, waiting for the right moment to move. This was no different. Confrontation for the sake of catharsis wasn't his style, and it never produced results. Still, as he sat in his parked truck just a few hundred feet from her property, watching from the angle of an unlined curb near the corner, the sight before him churned something deep in his chest that felt like both disbelief and bitter recognition. The ATV, unmistakably his, despite the superficial changes, sat displayed like a trophy in Karen's manicured backyard. It had been cleaned, yes, but also spray-coated in an off-white matte paint. A string of fake ivy had been draped lazily over the handlebars, and a small wooden sign, handwritten with some kind of faux artisan flourish, leaned against the front wheel. Reclaimed utility object. Repurposed for communal aesthetic. It didn't even make sense as a phrase. Garrett had dealt with corporate doublespeak and technocratic babble, but this was different. This was ego. This was someone staking a visual claim, not just on an object, but on a narrative. The story was no longer his machine. It was Karen's interpretation of an abandoned tool transformed into a curated expression of community chic. Garrett didn't knock on her door. He didn't step onto the property. Instead, he took 2 photos from a public sidewalk, wide angle, time-stamped, and drove directly to his attorney's office. It was an hour's drive, but he didn't mind. He hadn't spoken to Robert Wexler in almost 4 years, not since settling a licensing dispute with a vendor who'd stolen proprietary designs. Wexler was semi-retired now, more selective with his cases, but Garrett had been a good client, the kind who listened, documented everything, and never made impulsive decisions that needed legal mopping up. Wexler saw him the same afternoon. They reviewed the sheriff's report, the GPS tracker documentation, the photos, and Garrett's verbal account of the situation. Wexler didn't raise an eyebrow or express any visible emotion until Garrett got to the part about the handwritten reclaimed object sign. "That's not clever," Wexler said finally. "It's not even vaguely legal." "Can she say it was abandoned?" "Not if you had it locked in a shed on private property," Wexler replied. "There's no legal doctrine of salvage in residential neighborhoods. She's not the Coast Guard pulling wreckage out of the Atlantic. This is just straight-up removal of personal property without consent. Best case for her is a civil dispute. Worst case is conversion, potentially even petty theft if the county prosecutor feels spicy. But first we do this the easy way." Wexler drafted a letter. It was firm, direct, and professional. Not a threat, but an unmistakable warning. It cited local civil codes regarding property rights, vehicle classification, and unlawful transfer. It demanded the immediate return of the ATV in original condition, or monetary compensation equal to its assessed value. It included all relevant documentation, including the sheriff's case number and tracker logs, and gave Karen 72 hours to comply before further legal action would be initiated. Garrett left the office with a copy in hand, mailed another via certified delivery, and gave Wexler the green light to follow up as needed. He spent the next 3 days in relative silence. He didn't call her. He didn't check the yard. He kept to himself, organizing the garage, labeling tools, cleaning out his brother's old filing cabinet. The time passed, not peacefully, but productively. He didn't tell anyone what was going on, not because he wanted to hide it, but because it wasn't time for conversation. It was time for resolution. The letter, however, had clearly been received. On the 4th day, Karen made her move. Garrett came home from a supply run to find a folded note wedged into the storm door of his house. It was printed on cream cardstock with a watercolor image of lavender at the top corner. The handwriting was delicate, deliberate, and far too ornate for the message it carried. "Mr. Wells, I was dismayed to receive such a harsh letter when I have only acted out of concern for the safety and order of our shared neighborhood." The object in question was left unattended and unregistered, which placed it under community scrutiny. "I have repurposed it in good faith and for the enjoyment of others, not for personal gain. I urge you to reconsider pursuing litigation over something so minor. Life is short. Harmony is precious. Surely we can find a better use of time than dragging one another through the unpleasant machinery of bureaucracy. If you are insistent, I will consult with my own counsel." With grace, Karen Delaney Garrett read the letter 3 times. Then he placed it on the kitchen table, sat down, and stared at it as if it were a foreign artifact. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, just a veiled refusal wrapped in soft language, cloaked in implication. She wasn't backing down. She thought he'd blink. She thought, like many before her, that the threat of escalation was enough to cow someone into inaction. But Garrett had never been that man, and he certainly wasn't going to become him now. He called Wexler and gave him the go-ahead to file the preliminary civil claim. Wexler, ever efficient, submitted the necessary documents and sent formal notice through the proper channels. A process server delivered the complaint to Karen's doorstep 2 days later. Garrett didn't watch it happen. He was in the backyard, repairing a fence post that had snapped during a windstorm, when he heard the short conversation from a distance. Something about needing a signature, something about unreasonable behavior, and then the sharp sound of a door closing. What happened next wasn't a rebuttal. It wasn't a legal filing or a counterclaim. It was an invitation. A printed flyer began appearing in mailboxes up and down the street. Garrett received his along with the grocery coupons and water bill. It was designed like a magazine cover, with pastel colors and cursive fonts, a header that read Garden Revival and Design Showcase, and a list of scheduled events, live harp performance, artisanal honey tasting, an open-air poetry reading, and, at the bottom in bold script, featuring our community's latest reclaimed treasure, the patio sculpture. There was no photo, but Garrett didn't need one. He knew exactly what she meant. She was planning a public event, with his machine, on her property, while actively being sued for possession of it. He called Wexler again. "Let her do it," the lawyer said. "Document everything. Let her make it worse for herself. She's turning it into theater." Wexler sighed. "Then let her set the stage. We'll be waiting in the wings." Garrett did exactly that. He made no contact. He spoke to no one. But he prepared. He ensured that every photo, every receipt, every time-stamped image was stored in triplicate. He reached out to his insurance company and provided them with a copy of the pending claim, asking them to flag any incidents involving the vehicle. He updated the GPS tracker's ping interval. He gathered witness statements, not because he asked, but because people began to volunteer them. One man from down the street, whose wife had overheard Karen bragging about giving new life to junk, dropped off a written account. Another woman emailed Garrett after recognizing the ATV from years ago when Mark used to ride it around the trail, back when the neighborhood was quieter and no one cared how the grass was cut. The event approached like a slow-moving storm, one that announced itself far in advance but didn't change course. Garrett didn't plan to attend. That wasn't his goal. His goal was reclamation. Quiet, lawful, absolute. But if she insisted on parading her own arrogance in front of the community, he would not interfere. Not yet, because some lessons aren't taught through argument. Some lessons aren't delivered with lectures or letters or courtroom statements. Some lessons come roaring through garden tents at 20 miles per hour, leaving a trail of crushed decor, overturned planters, and the unmistakable sound of consequences catching up. The morning of the event arrived with the kind of crisp, deliberate air that signaled the transition from late spring to something more performative. A seasonal posture meant to impress rather than nourish. Garrett woke early, not out of anxiety but habit. He brewed a strong pot of coffee, black and bitter as he liked it, and stood by the back window as the steam curled into the stale air of the kitchen. From his vantage point, he could just make out the edge of Karen's backyard. White tents had been erected the night before, held in place with sandbags and stakes driven into the earth with almost militant precision. Tables were arranged in rows, covered with pale blue linen and matching ceramic centerpieces. Folding chairs stood at obedient angles, awaiting their occupants with the hollow patience of things made for ceremony. And at the far end, under a shaded alcove near the trimmed hedge wall, was the ATV. It was now fully entombed in decor, wrapped in flowing synthetic fabric, perched atop a wooden platform framed by two potted trees that had been wheeled in for the occasion. A handwritten sign sat on an easel beside it, declaring in a looping calligraphy, "Renaissance of the Rural, an homage to repurposed motion." Garrett let out a single breath of air, Not quite a laugh, but something close to a release of tension. It wasn't anger that stirred in him. It was something older. Exhaustion mingled with the wry understanding that people like Karen didn't actually expect consequences. They simply expected control. He spent the morning tightening the bolts on his own gate, cleaning the tools he had left out from the day before, and making quiet calls to his attorney, to the insurance contact, to the local assessor's office to reconfirm the property boundaries. Every detail aligned. Everything was in place. He wasn't planning to do anything yet. That wasn't the point. The point was to know, down to the inch and clause, where his rights began and where hers ended. By midday, the event had begun. Cars began to arrive, mostly crossovers and clean sedans with magnetic door signs advertising small businesses, local art dealers, gardening cooperatives, personal chefs. Women in pastel sundresses and men in expensive casual wear walked past his property like he didn't exist, their eyes forward, hands clutching reusable canvas totes printed with slogans about intentional living and community growth. He didn't recognize most of them. That was the trick with these neighborhoods. Half the faces were transients with long leases and short memories. The other half pretended to forget whatever was inconvenient to acknowledge. Garrett kept to his yard, but even there he could hear her voice. Karen stood near the platform, introducing the ATV to groups of attendees with practiced theatricality, describing it as a relic of bygone utility, now reclaimed for peace. She didn't say Garrett's name. She never referenced a previous owner. But she made insinuations about how it had been rescued from disuse, about how some people don't understand how to let go. She received nods, polite laughs, murmurs of admiration. The absurdity would have been laughable if it hadn't been so methodically executed. Garrett took a walk to clear his mind, looping around the block, taking back alleys, letting his feet decide the route. When he returned 2 hours later, a paper cone filled with lavender ice cream in his hand, bought from a food cart parked across from the event, he found something that shifted the air around him in an instant. The side gate of his property, the one that led into the wooded easement, had been unlatched. Not broken, not cut, just deliberately unlatched, the padlock dangling open like a warning, left by someone too arrogant to hide their intrusion. Garrett knelt, examining the latch, the ground around it. A faint heel imprint in the dirt. Size 6 or 7, narrow toe. Not a boot, not a work shoe. A deliberate, controlled trespass. Someone wanting him to know they'd been there, but confident he wouldn't retaliate. He relocked the gate and walked back into the house without a word. He didn't call the police. He didn't take photos. He already knew what the report would say. No damage, no witness, no cause for intervention. He sat at the kitchen table and looked again at the copy of the Karen's event flyer, the one that had arrived in his mailbox a week prior. He folded it slowly, carefully, and tucked it into a manila envelope alongside his insurance documents and a fresh set of photographs showing the ATV in its current state. Then he printed out one more thing, an affidavit, pre-signed by a notary at Wexler's office, verifying his ownership of the vehicle and attesting to its removal without consent. He slipped the envelope into his jacket pocket and walked back outside, this time heading in the direction of the event. He entered through the east path, where the decorative hedge had a small break to accommodate strollers and foot traffic. No one stopped him. No one asked who he was. That was the benefit of being unremarkable when you needed to be. He blended in, nodded when people nodded at him, and made his way toward the platform. Karen was mid-sentence, speaking to a trio of attendees about narrative ownership and the value of reinterpretation. Garrett waited until she paused to take a sip of something in a clear plastic flute. Then he stepped forward, reached up, and laid his hand on the ATV's front rack. She froze. The people around her turned. "I'm taking it back now," he said. His voice wasn't raised. He didn't look at the crowd. Karen set her drink down. "I don't think that's appropriate." Garrett looked at her directly. "I have legal ownership. I have filed claim. I've issued formal demand. You've been served. That's my property, Karen. And you've had your show." She glanced at the crowd, then back to him. "This is private property, Mr. Wells." "Correct, which is why I didn't come with a trailer or the police. I'm walking it out, right now." "You'll embarrass yourself." "No," Garrett said. "I'm embarrassing you. There's a difference." With that, he stepped onto the platform, unstrapped the fabric from the handlebars, and sat down. The ATV started on the first attempt. It still purred under him like it had the first night he brought it back to life. The crowd stepped back instinctively. Karen shouted something about damage, about violation, but he didn't hear it. He was already moving. Slowly, deliberately, he drove it off the platform, down the grass, across the decorative mulch, over one poorly placed ceramic sculpture that cracked beneath the wheels with a satisfying crunch. He rolled through the exit path, out past the hedge and onto the public trail behind the houses, never exceeding a crawl, never glancing back. Once he reached the edge of his property, he cut the engine and sat in the silence. The absurdity of what had just happened washed over him like cold water. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't victory. It was restoration. Later that afternoon, after the event had crumbled under the weight of its own disruption, Karen left a message on his voicemail. Her voice was calm, formal, almost brittle with composure. "I will be filing a restraining order," she said. "You've made a serious mistake. This isn't over." Garrett listened to the message twice. Then he called Wexler, forwarded the recording, and made himself a fresh cup of coffee. Outside, the ATV sat under a canvas tarp, safe again, silent. And for the first time since this whole thing had begun, Garrett allowed himself a small smile, not of triumph, but of confirmation. He wasn't fighting for dominance. He was fighting to be left the hell alone. And now she knew what it looked like when he said no. 3 days passed with an eerie kind of quiet, the type of silence that doesn't soothe but stretches across a neighborhood like a sheet too tightly pulled over a mattress. Flat, tense, and waiting to snap. Garrett kept his movements simple and visible. He worked in the open, trimming back hedges, replacing weather stripping along the side doors, sweeping the gravel near the workshop. Not because he wanted to be watched, but because he knew he was being watched anyway. Karen hadn't confronted him directly since the incident at her garden showcase, but small things had begun to shift. A paper flyer advertising a community decorum initiative appeared tacked to his mailbox, unsigned but clearly authored in her tone. The garbage bins were moved several feet off their usual placement, and the front gate latch was discovered jammed with gravel, an annoying, petty obstruction that meant someone had reached over and tampered with it. These weren't accidents. They were the kinds of calculated inconveniences that people like Karen believed to be sophisticated punishment, subtle gestures designed to provoke without triggering formal action. But Garrett wasn't playing that game. He logged each incident in a notebook by date and time, with photographs where relevant, and moved on. On the 4th day, a letter arrived, not from Karen but from the office of a lawyer, Gerald Stone, Esquire, a name that sounded less like an actual person and more like the legal version of a security system decal. The letter was formal, humorless, and composed entirely in the stiff cadence of someone who believed big words would make weak arguments stronger. It alleged that Garrett had willfully disrupted a private event, caused undue damage to landscaping and property, and acted in a manner unbecoming of a neighbor. The letter concluded by suggesting an immediate mediation session to resolve this matter amicably before escalation. Garrett read it twice, then once more aloud, not because he was surprised, but because the absurdity deserved to be heard in full voice at least once. He called Wexler, who took one look at the scanned copy and let out a low grunt of annoyance. "They don't have a case," Wexler said. "You didn't trespass. You retrieved your own property in plain sight, without force, without threat. The event was public. The damage was negligible and unintentional. You're documented. You're clean. Garrett asked whether they should respond or ignore it. We respond, Wexler said, but not with aggression. We frame it as a preemptive defense, affirm that your actions were lawful and measured, offer a brief rebuttal, and politely decline mediation. That way, if they try to escalate, we've already taken the reasonable high ground. The reply went out that same afternoon. Garrett didn't expect it to end the matter, and it didn't. 2 days later, a man in a dusty blue SUV pulled into Garrett's driveway without announcement. He was in his late 30s, thin, with too much energy in his movements and a clipboard in his hand. He introduced himself as an independent assessor for the Community Aesthetic Oversight Committee, a phrase so fabricated it nearly made Garrett laugh. The man said he was there to inspect potential code violations regarding property upkeep and unregistered mechanical devices. Garrett didn't invite him past the gate. He simply asked for ID, then a copy of his work order, then stood silently as the man became increasingly defensive. "Look, I'm just doing what I was asked," the assessor finally said. "There was a complaint." "There always is," Garrett replied. "You're free to contest the findings if there's anything reported." "There won't be," Garrett said, and without another word he closed the gate, then placed a call to the county office to report an unauthorized visit. Within hours, it was confirmed. No such committee existed under official jurisdiction. The man had been hired privately. Karen had sent him. That night, Garrett walked the perimeter of his property again, not out of fear, but calculation. He checked locks, rearmed the motion lights, and made note of the blind spots that needed tightening. He wasn't afraid of retaliation. He was preparing for pattern escalation, because that's what this was now. Not a neighborly dispute. Not even a civil disagreement. It had become a narrative conflict where Karen no longer cared about the object itself, but about the story she believed she was entitled to tell. She wanted to be the one wronged, the custodian of neighborhood grace besieged by the brute at the end of the road. Garrett had disrupted that storyline, and she was rewriting it with every petty maneuver. On the 6th day, another notice arrived, this time an official-looking envelope from the regional zoning office. It stated that a complaint had been filed alleging that Garrett's structure, a detached storage shed near the back of the lot, was being used for unauthorized mechanical repair outside permitted activity. The wording was precise, suspiciously so, and Garrett recognized instantly that it was rooted not in regulation, but in proximity. Someone had watched him work and had made the connection to the ATV repairs. He called the zoning office, requested the complaint in writing, and filed a formal rebuttal with photographic evidence and records of his brother's prior use of the structure. Again, he didn't panic. He documented. He acted. He delegated what needed legal framing to Wexler and followed instructions to the letter. It was slow work, frustrating work, but it was solid, and that was all he needed. Solidity. A week later, Wexler called with an update. "She's trying to play the system into grinding you down," he said, "but she's overplaying it. We're documenting every move. Every complaint she files, every private contractor she sends, every subtle harassment tactic. Eventually it will tip the balance, and when it does, we'll move for injunctive relief and file a civil harassment claim. You just need to hold steady." Garrett thanked him and hung up. Then he sat alone in his living room, the evening light pooling across the floorboards, and thought, not about Karen or the ATV or even the next legal step, but about something else entirely. He thought about pressure, how it builds over time, not always in bursts but in fine increments, a slow tightening of conditions until the valve gives out. Karen was counting on attrition. But Garrett wasn't eroding. He was distilling, concentrating, preparing, because there's a difference between cracking and compressing. And she hadn't yet learned how sharp things become when you squeeze them long enough. It started with a petition, a single sheet of printer paper folded into thirds and slipped into Garrett's mailbox without postage or envelope. Just his name in block letters on the front and a polite, "Hello, neighbor," header in cheerful font across the top. The body of the text was less cheerful. It alleged that recent events and disruptions had brought into question the suitability of certain property practices in their otherwise peaceful street. It went on to request support for the creation of a neighborhood code of conduct, including restrictions on mechanical repairs performed outdoors, limitations on noise-generating equipment, and an outright ban on the use or storage of non-licensed recreational or agricultural vehicles within visible proximity to community-accessible areas. At the bottom were 5 signatures, none of them familiar, likely newer residents from deeper into the cul-de-sac, people Garrett hadn't spoken to beyond. The occasional wave. It wasn't the petition itself that caught him off guard. He'd been waiting for something like this, but the subtle cruelty of it, masked in a voice of cooperative improvement. It wasn't about machines or property. It was about power through indirect regulation. They couldn't take what was his, so they'd try to legislate his presence out of their view. Garrett folded the petition neatly and placed it into a folder already thick with similar materials. Incident reports, complaint copies, lawyer letters, timestamps, photos, and witness notes. He wasn't building a defense anymore. He was building a record, one comprehensive enough to stand on its own when this eventually landed in court or county arbitration. The next day, Karen escalated. That was her rhythm now. Every setback matched by a bolder assertion, every pause filled with another performance of principled indignation. This time, it came in the form of a community bulletin stapled to the old message board near the trailhead, where local announcements usually included lost pet notices, bake sales, and junior soccer schedules. Karen's notice was more elaborate. A printed flyer with formal serif fonts and a full-color banner at the top reading, "Preserving our neighborhood's character, an open discussion." Below that, it invited residents concerned about recent behavior and property misuse to attend a special evening meeting on her lawn, featuring guest speakers from a local neighborhood development nonprofit and a demonstration of how thoughtful landscape curation promotes wellness. It didn't name Garrett, but the phrasing was surgical, calibrated to imply blame without offering him the chance to respond. Garrett stood at the board for a long minute, reading the flyer twice, then slowly removed it, took it home, scanned it, and filed it with the others. That night, around 8:30, he took a walk, not his usual trail loop, but a full street circuit, moving quietly along the sidewalks, watching houses glow with television light behind pulled curtains. It wasn't reconnaissance. It was affirmation. These homes, their inhabitants, their routines, none of them had changed except in the wake of the Karen's Theater. Garrett wasn't the outsider. He was just the one who didn't clap along. 2 mornings later, he returned from a supply store run to find a police cruiser idling outside his gate. Not parked, idling, angled in such a way as to suggest lingering. Garrett approached with measured calm, toolbox still in hand, and offered a brief nod. The officer, a woman in her early 40s, polite but professionally aloof, said she was responding to a call regarding a possible unregistered vehicle on private property being used in a potentially unsafe manner. Garrett's brow lifted slightly. But he nodded, set the toolbox down, and motioned for her to follow him around back. The ATV sat beneath its new custom cover, purchased specifically for this moment, with its registration tag laminated and attached by zip tie, plainly visible through a plastic window. The officer inspected it, jotted a few notes, and asked if it had been moved since the last known incident. Garrett replied that it had not, and produced a printed log of tracker pings, confirming stationary status. The officer thanked him, apologized for the inconvenience, and left without further inquiry. Garrett didn't watch her drive away. He walked back to the shed, stood in the doorway for a full minute, and exhaled. It was only a matter of time before the police would stop responding to these calls with neutrality. Karen didn't need results. She needed repetition. The illusion of pattern. Enough of those, and real consequences might follow, even if built on fiction. Garrett met with Wexler the next day. They sat across from one another in the lawyer's quiet office, surrounded by shelves of aging leather binders and a hum of quiet air conditioning. Wexler listened carefully, took notes, then leaned back with his usual, unreadable expression. "She's baiting you," he said. "You know this. Every escalation is meant to provoke an overreach. She wants you angry. She wants you loud. She wants a moment of footage or audio that turns you into the aggressor." Garrett nodded. "I've got nothing to give her." "Good," Wexler said. "Then we give her the opposite. Silence backed by process. We file the harassment claim this week. We request a cease and desist for private investigation impersonation. We include the zoning complaint and the police visit as part of a broader intimidation pattern. If she wants drama, let her bring it to court under oath." Garrett agreed, and the wheels were set in motion. That weekend, Garrett stayed home. He kept his tools packed away, let the lawn grow an inch too long, didn't run the ATV or open the shed. He moved slowly, deliberately, offering nothing that could be described or reported. But even still, Karen found her angle. On Sunday afternoon, he heard movement on the shared easement behind the house. Not loud, not fast, just the faint crunch of grass and twigs beneath feet trying too hard to be quiet. Garrett stepped out the back door and moved without haste to the edge of the yard, where the wooden privacy fence met the slope. There, through a gap in the boards, he saw a young man, early 20s, camera slung around his neck, holding a notepad and awkwardly adjusting his posture like someone trying to look casual after being caught. Garrett called out evenly, "Can I help you?" The man flinched, turned, and offered a rehearsed smile. "Oh, hi. I'm with the Greenfield Community Digest, doing a piece on local land use. Just getting some photos of natural buffers and mixed property zones." Garrett studied him for a moment, then asked, "What's your name?" "Kyle," the man said quickly. "Kyle what?" Sorensen." Garrett nodded once. "Get off my property, Kyle." The young man opened his mouth, closed it again, then turned and left without another word. Garrett didn't call the police. He didn't need to. He had the face, the camera, the lie. He logged the encounter, noted the time, described the man, and sent the information to Wexler. Later, through a quiet channel, Wexler confirmed there was no Greenfield Community Digest. There was no local journalist named Kyle Sorensen. But there was a niece, Karen's niece, a recent college graduate with a photography portfolio that included community portraiture. She'd been seen at the showcase weeks earlier. Garrett didn't even flinch. He just added it to the ledger. That night, he received a voicemail. Karen's voice, carefully modulated, politely clipped. "I understand you've filed some sort of claim against me. I had hoped we could resolve things like adults, but since you've decided otherwise, please understand that I'm fully prepared to defend myself and my rights. The neighborhood supports me. This is bigger than your machinery." Garrett didn't respond. He let the message expire. Then he returned to the shed, uncovered the ATV, and stood beside it for a while, hand resting on the seat. Not out of sentimentality, but intent. Because while Karen believed this was a contest of perception, Garrett had moved beyond that. He wasn't defending a machine. He was protecting space. And the line had been crossed so many times now, it was no longer a matter of if, but how far she was willing to go before the whole street saw what she really was. The cease and desist was served on a Tuesday morning just after 9, hand-delivered by a neutral third party hired by Wexler, a retired deputy who didn't flinch at Karen's attempts to make the encounter uncomfortable. She had prepared for the delivery like a theater performance. Her front lawn freshly watered, sunglasses perched on her head, a clipboard in hand as if reviewing critical documents while seated beneath a decorative umbrella stand. The man had walked up, handed her the envelope, identified himself by first name only, and left without comment, ignoring her questions about what exactly this was supposed to mean. Garrett watched from a distance, not because he needed to see it, but because this part mattered. Not for theatrics or satisfaction, but as the final professional gesture before the inevitable descent. Karen's world was built on the illusion of dominance, on the idea that authority stemmed not from structure or statute, but from tone, implication, and the confidence to act as if her actions were already justified. When someone like her encountered process, official, emotionless, inescapable, something cracked. Garrett didn't know if it would be fast or slow, but he knew it would come, and when it did, the rupture wouldn't be about the ATV or the letters or the petitions. It would be about control. He spent the next 24 hours methodically. He replaced the aging locks on the garage doors, installed 2 new motion-activated floodlights on the perimeter fence, and confirmed with Wexler that the harassment claim had been accepted into the county's low-level civil track. It wouldn't lead to criminal charges or anything explosive. That wasn't the point. The point was pressure. Legal, documented, layered pressure. Real consequences not rooted in conflict, but in escalation. On Thursday afternoon, it happened. The unraveling. Garrett had just finished stacking firewood along the side of the shed when he heard voices. Raised, indignant, straining for composure. He stepped quietly around the back edge of the property and saw the unmistakable figure of Karen standing beside a police cruiser, her arms moving as she spoke, gestures sharp and practiced. The officer, a different one this time, younger, looked less engaged, nodding occasionally but not writing anything down. Garrett didn't approach. He waited, watched, listened from a distance, just close enough to catch pieces. Deliberate obstruction, malicious intent, emotionally distressing, creating division. The phrases were dramatic but hollow, strung together like excerpts from a speech never actually read aloud. After nearly 10 minutes, the officer walked to Garrett's gate and knocked. Garrett answered. The conversation was brief, civil. The officer said a complaint had been made alleging continued psychological intimidation and property misuse. Garrett handed over the file Wexler had prepared, a summarized log of events, legal filings, the letter trail, and photos. The officer flipped through them without protest, thanked him, and left. Karen remained on the sidewalk, pretending not to watch. That night, she escalated again, but not through law, not through formal channels. She acted. Around 2:15 a.m., Garrett's phone buzzed with a ping from the motion sensors tied to his security app. He sat up, pulled the feed onto his tablet, and watched the grainy infrared footage with a strange calm. A figure, short, narrow frame, was at the shed. The lock had already been broken. The door opened. A flashlight beam swept across the ATV. Garrett stood, dressed quickly, and stepped outside without rush or noise. He approached the shed from the side, using the tall hedges as cover, and stopped 10 feet away as the figure stepped fully into the light. Karen. Not a relative, not a contractor. Karen herself. No mask, no hesitation. She was examining the handlebars with one gloved hand, something in her other hand that Garrett couldn't immediately identify. He didn't call out. He took a photo from his phone, zoomed in, time-stamped. Then he stepped forward. She didn't hear him until he was within arm's reach. "You're trespassing," he said flatly. Karen spun around, dropping whatever she'd been holding. It clattered, a small canister, likely paint or solvent. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. "I thought I heard a noise," she began, but Garrett held up his phone. "You're being recorded. You broke the lock. You entered without permission. You're carrying unauthorized materials near my registered property. I want you off my land now." She stood frozen for 3 seconds, 4, then turned and stormed past him, head low, arms tight against her ribs. Garrett didn't stop her. He didn't touch her. He followed at a slow, steady pace, watching her disappear across the street and into her own yard. The shed door hung open behind him, the smell of chemical irritant already rising. Garrett didn't sleep. He didn't even go back inside. He sat in a folding chair on the porch, the photo still glowing on his phone, and waited for morning. By noon, Wexler had received the footage, the images, the time-stamped logs, and the physical canister itself, retrieved with gloves and placed in an evidence bag. That afternoon, Karen received a visit. Not from Garrett, but from a deputy carrying a formal notice of intent to file criminal trespass charges. The look on her face, captured accidentally by a neighbor's dash cam as she stepped out onto her lawn, was not one of outrage. It was disbelief, as if none of it could possibly apply to her, as if consequence was an abstract idea that only happened to people who didn't own stationary sets or well-ironed trousers. Garrett didn't celebrate. He didn't gloat. He simply locked the shed again, reinforced the interior, and finally, quietly, moved the ATV into storage off-site. Not out of fear, but finality. It was never about the machine. It was about space, autonomy, the right to exist without being curated. Karen had pushed and pushed and pushed, and now the pushback was systemic, documented, inevitable. The story she'd written had changed. She was no longer the protector of civility. She was the defendant. And all she could do now was wait for her own paper trail to arrive. The weeks that followed were unremarkable in the way only resolution can be. Quiet, slow-moving, and slightly disorienting after the storm of confrontation had finally passed. Garrett went back to his routines, not because they were soothing, but because they were stable. He repaired the fencing around the back trail, painted the shed doors a flat matte gray, and replaced the scorched grass near the garden beds with new soil and seed. The ATV remained in off-site storage, protected and untouched, not because he feared further escalation, but because its presence had served its purpose, and now its absence marked a deliberate return to calm. Karen had gone still. That was the only way he could describe it. She wasn't gone, wasn't hiding, but the performance had stopped. Her emails ceased. No more flyers, no more statements at the trail bulletin board. The neighborhood meetings were suddenly rescheduled indefinitely, and the decorative planters that once lined her driveway sat unwatered and cracked under the summer heat. She still emerged occasionally, taking out trash, checking mail, but the weight around her posture was visible, as if the armor she had worn for years had become too heavy to carry now that people saw what was under it. The charges hadn't yet gone to court. Wexler explained that the wheels of local justice moved slower than most would like, but the paper trail was solid, the affidavit signed, the police report clean. A court date was inevitable. Karen had retained counsel, but that didn't surprise Garrett. He knew she wouldn't face consequences easily. That wasn't the point. The point was that her actions no longer lived in the realm of suggestion and rumor. They existed in documents, timestamps, witness statements, and video. For someone like Karen, whose entire presence had been curated around the illusion of unassailable correctness, exposure was its own verdict. Neighbors spoke to Garrett more openly now. A man down the street brought over a broken wheelbarrow for advice on repair. A retired couple from 2 doors over offered him fresh tomatoes from their backyard garden. No one brought up Karen by name, and Garrett didn't push the topic, but the gestures were clear. People had seen what had happened. They'd watched quietly as things unfolded, and now they responded in the only ways people in such neighborhoods knew how, with acknowledgement by action, not words. One afternoon, as Garrett swept the driveway, he saw Karen across the street standing under the eave of her porch. She looked older somehow, her shoulders less squared, her movements unhurried in a way that suggested exhaustion rather than peace. She didn't wave. Neither did he. There was nothing to say. She knew, and he knew she knew. That was enough. The court summons arrived a week later with the official date. Garrett marked it on the calendar but didn't feel dread or anticipation. It would be handled. Not publicly, not dramatically, just resolved. That was all he had ever wanted. Not vengeance, not spectacle, just space. Space to exist without interference, to fix things that mattered, to grieve the past without someone narrating over it. He spent that weekend walking the boundary of his property, marking trees that needed trimming and noting which gutters still pulled slightly during heavy rain. It felt like his again. Not inherited, not temporary, but his. The final moment came in the smallest form. A letter. Folded once, no return address placed quietly at the foot of his door. He opened it slowly, already expecting the tone. Apologetic without confession. Defensive without aggression. But it surprised him. There was no apology. No justifications. Just a single line, handwritten in neat, narrow script. You kept your ground. I didn't think you would. No name. No signature. But it was her. He didn't need proof. He folded the letter, placed it in the same file where everything else now lived, and slid the drawer shut. It was over, not erased, not forgotten, but finished. And Garrett, who had never asked for a fight, who had only ever asked to be left alone, finally was.